The sun was just beginning to rise over London as the plane carrying Chuck Norris descended through the clouds. The legendary martial artist, actor, and all-around tough guy had arrived in the United Kingdom for what was supposed to be a peaceful visit. He wasn't there to fight or make headlines. Instead, he had come to spread goodwill by participating in charity events across the city. For years, people around the world had heard stories about his incredible strength and larger-than-life personality. But today, he was simply a guest in one of Europe's most historic cities. As soon as the aircraft touched down at Heathrow Airport, excitement buzzed in the air. Word had spread quickly that Chuck Norris was arriving, and fans of all ages gathered near the terminal, holding posters with his name on them and chanting his famous catchphrases. Some even wore cowboy hats and karate uniforms, hoping to mimic their hero. When Chuck finally emerged from the gate, wearing his signature confident smile and a leather jacket, the crowd erupted into cheers. Children pointed excitedly, teenagers snapped pictures on their phones, and adults shook their heads in disbelief, whispering to each other, "Is that really him?" Chuck waved warmly, taking it all in stride. Despite being known worldwide for his unbeatable roundhouse kicks and countless action movies, he remained humble. As he walked toward the baggage claim area, reporters swarmed around him, firing questions left and right. "What brings you to London, Mr. Norris?" one asked. Another chimed in, "Any plans to teach us some self-defense moves while you're here?" Chuck chuckled good-naturedly, answering briefly before politely excusing himself. His schedule was packed, and he wanted to make the most of his time in the city. Little did anyone know, however, that this trip would turn out to be far more eventful than anyone could have imagined. Chuck had no idea that within hours he'd find himself entangled in an incident involving one of Britain's oldest traditions, the Royal Guardsmen stationed outside Buckingham Palace. These stoic soldiers, dressed in their iconic red coats and towering bearskin hats, were symbols of discipline and order. They stood motionless for hours, rain or shine, earning admiration from visitors worldwide. But sometimes tradition and modern-day chaos collide. And when they do, sparks can fly. For now, though, everything seemed calm. Chuck climbed into a waiting car, ready to explore the sights of London. He glanced out the window as the vehicle pulled away from the airport, watching the sprawling city unfold before him. Towering buildings gave way to charming streets, lined with quaint shops and historic landmarks. It felt like stepping back in time, yet the energy of the bustling metropolis was undeniable. Chuck couldn't wait to see it all. The clock tower of Big Ben, the mysterious corridors of the Tower of London, and, of course, the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. But deep down, something stirred inside him. Chuck Norris wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, and forces of nature don't always blend seamlessly into quiet routines. Unbeknownst to him, fate had other plans for his London adventure, plans that would test his patience, challenge his sense of justice, and ultimately lead to one of the most talked-about moments of his life. After settling into his hotel and grabbing a quick bite to eat, Chuck Norris decided it was time to explore the city. He had always been fascinated by history, and London was brimming with stories that stretched back centuries. With his trusty leather jacket on and a camera slung over his shoulder, he set out to see some of the most iconic landmarks the city had to offer. Little did he know, this casual stroll would soon lead him straight into an unexpected adventure. His first stop was Big Ben, the towering clock tower that stood proudly along the River Thames. Tourists milled about, snapping photos and marveling at its grandeur. Chuck joined them, standing quietly as he gazed up at the structure. "It's even more impressive in person," he muttered to himself, tilting his head back to take it all in. A few people recognized him and shyly asked for pictures, which he happily obliged. Chuck had a way of making everyone feel comfortable, whether they were meeting him for the first time or simply passing by. From there, he made his way to the Tower of London, a fortress steeped in tales of kings, queens, and intrigue. As he wandered through the ancient halls, listening to guides recount stories of royal betrayals and hidden treasures, Chuck couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. "This place has seen more drama than all my movies combined," he joked to his assistant, who laughed nervously. Even though Chuck was known for his tough exterior, he had a soft spot for history and culture. It reminded him of how small we all are compared to the passage of time. Finally, Chuck arrived at Buckingham Palace, the crown jewel of British monarchy. The palace gates were flanked by royal guardsmen, their crimson uniforms and towering bearskin hats making them look almost larger than life. Chuck paused to admire their discipline. These men stood perfectly still, no matter what happened around them. Children ran past, couples posed for selfies, and street performers entertained nearby. Yet the guards didn't so much as blink. "Now that's dedication," Chuck said aloud, nodding approvingly. He leaned against the railing, watching the scene unfold. Families gathered to snap photos with the guards in the background, while others tried to get creative shots by pretending to push over the statuesque soldiers. Chuck chuckled at their antics, but also felt a pang of respect for the guards. Standing motionless for hours wasn't easy, especially when surrounded by crowds eager to test your patience. "These guys are tougher than my roundhouse kicks," he quipped to his assistant, who grinned at the comment. As the minutes passed, Chuck noticed something unusual. A group of tourists nearby seemed intent on causing trouble. They weren't just taking silly pictures. They were mocking the guards outright. One man shouted insults, another poked fun at the guard's rigid posture, and a third tossed a crumpled piece of paper toward the soldier's boots. Chuck frowned, feeling uneasy. He understood lighthearted fun, but this crossed a line. Respect was something he valued deeply, and seeing these men ridiculed bothered him more than he cared to admit. Still, Chuck tried to ignore it. He reminded himself that he was here as a visitor, not an enforcer. But as the situation escalated, with the rowdy group growing louder and bolder, he realized he might not be able to stay silent for long. His instincts told him that sometimes stepping in was the right thing to do, even if it came with consequences. And unbeknownst to him, those consequences were about to change the course of his day, and maybe even his reputation, forever. The scene outside Buckingham Palace was beginning to spiral out of control. The group of rowdy tourists, emboldened by their own antics, seemed determined to push the limits of what they could get away with. Their laughter echoed through the area as they continued to taunt the royal guardsmen stationed near the gates. One man shouted exaggerated impressions of the guard's stiff posture, while another mimicked the soldiers' movements, or lack thereof, with mocking gestures. A woman in the group even held up her phone to record the spectacle, clearly hoping to capture something funny for social media. Chuck Norris stood nearby, his arms crossed and his brow furrowed. At first, he had tried to ignore the commotion, telling himself it wasn't his place to intervene. After all, these were British grounds, governed by British rules, and he was just a visitor. But as the behavior escalated, his patience began to wear thin. When one of the troublemakers threw a crumpled candy wrapper at the guard's feet, Chuck clenched his jaw. He glanced around, hoping someone else would step forward to restore order. But no one did. The other tourists either laughed along or looked away, unwilling to confront the chaos unfolding before them. Finally, Chuck decided enough was enough. He took a deep breath and approached the group calmly, his towering frame drawing immediate attention. "Hey there," he said in a firm but measured tone. "You might want to cool it down a bit. These guards are here doing their job, and they deserve respect." For a moment, the crowd fell silent. Some of the tourists recognized him instantly, whispering excitedly to each other. "Is that Chuck Norris?" one of them muttered under their breath. But the leader of the unruly group, a scruffy-looking man wearing sunglasses despite the overcast weather, wasn't impressed. In fact, he smirked, clearly amused by the idea that a celebrity thought he could tell them what to do. "Oh yeah," the man shot back, folding his arms defiantly. "And who made you the fun police? You're not even from here." Chuck didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his piercing gaze locking onto the man's eyes. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's day," he replied evenly. "But messing with someone who's just standing there doing their duty isn't funny. It's disrespectful. Maybe take your jokes somewhere else." The man hesitated for a split second, perhaps unsettled by Chuck's imposing presence. But then his bravado returned. "What are you gonna do about it, tough guy?" he sneered, taking a step forward as if to challenge him. His friends snickered nervously, egging him on. It was clear they saw this as some kind of game, oblivious to how quickly things could escalate. Chuck sighed inwardly, realizing that words alone weren't going to solve this. He glanced briefly at the Royal Guardsman, whose expression remained stoic and unreadable. For a moment, Chuck wondered how the guard managed to stay so composed in the face of such blatant disrespect. It was almost admirable, but also infuriating. How could people treat someone tasked with protecting their nation's heritage like a prop for their amusement? As the tension mounted, Chuck weighed his options. He knew he couldn't simply walk away. Not now. Doing nothing would mean condoning their behavior, which went against everything he believed in. On the other hand, stepping in too aggressively might only make matters worse. Still, deep down, he felt a responsibility to act. Respect wasn't just a word. It was a principle he lived by, and he wasn't about to let a few troublemakers trample all over it. Unbeknownst to everyone present, the next few seconds would change the course of the afternoon and leave an indelible mark on both Chuck Norris and the city of London. The air grew thick with tension as Chuck Norris stood face to face with the unruly tourist who had been mocking the Royal Guardsman. The man's smirk widened, clearly underestimating the situation. And the man standing before him. His friends egged him on, laughing and shouting taunts like, "Come on, tough guy. What are you gonna do?" Their voices carried through the square, drawing more attention from bystanders. Some watched in amusement, while others looked uneasy, sensing that something was about to happen. Chuck didn't say a word. Instead, he locked eyes with the troublemaker, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. For years, people had joked about Chuck Norris being unstoppable, almost mythical. Someone who could knock down doors with a single kick or disarm opponents without breaking a sweat. But this wasn't Hollywood. It was real life. And yet, there was no denying the aura of authority that radiated from him. Even the rowdy group seemed to hesitate for a brief moment, unsure if they had pushed things too far. Then, without warning, the ringleader made his move, or at least tried to. In an attempt to provoke Chuck further, he took another step forward, jabbing a finger into Chuck's chest. "You think you're so tough, huh? Go ahead, try something," he barked, his voice dripping with false bravado. It was a challenge, one designed to humiliate Chuck in front of the growing crowd. But instead of backing down, Chuck did the unexpected. He acted. In one swift motion, Chuck raised his fist and delivered a punch that landed squarely on the man's jaw. It wasn't a full-force blow, the kind you'd see in his action movies, but it was enough to send the troublemaker stumbling backward, clutching his face in shock. Gasps rippled through the crowd as everyone froze, trying to process what had just happened. 1 second, the scene had been chaotic and loud. The next, it was eerily silent, save for the groans of the fallen man. But the real surprise came not from the punch itself. It was the reaction of the Royal Guardsman. Trained to remain immovable and detached, the guard instinctively flinched when the altercation broke out. His hand twitched toward his rifle as he straightened slightly, his posture shifting ever so subtly. Though he didn't engage physically, the sudden movement caught the attention of nearby police officers stationed around the palace grounds. Within moments, 2 officers rushed over, their radios crackling as they assessed the situation. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded, stepping between Chuck and the now recovering troublemaker. The crowd erupted into murmurs, pointing fingers and snapping photos. Someone shouted, "Chuck Norris just punched that guy." Another added, "Did you see the guard move? I thought they weren't allowed to react." Chuck raised his hands calmly, signaling that he wasn't a threat. "Officer, I was only trying to stop him from harassing the guard," he explained, his voice steady and measured. "Things got out of hand, but I didn't mean any harm." Despite his explanation, the officers weren't convinced. They asked Chuck to step aside while they questioned witnesses and assessed the damage caused by the scuffle. Meanwhile, the troublemaker staggered to his feet, still holding his jaw. "You're gonna regret this," he spat, glaring at Chuck. But his words lacked conviction. Whatever confidence he had earlier had vanished after tasting the raw power behind Chuck's strike, even if it had been restrained. The rest of his group scattered, realizing the fun had turned serious. As the police began taking statements, whispers spread among the onlookers. Some praised Chuck for standing up for the guard, while others criticized him for using force. Regardless of opinions, one thing was certain: this incident would not be forgotten anytime soon. And unbeknownst to Chuck, the consequences of his actions were about to ripple far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. The scene outside Buckingham Palace quickly turned into a whirlwind of activity. Police officers swarmed the area, their radios crackling with urgent updates as they tried to piece together what had happened. Tourists who had been casually snapping photos just moments earlier were now pressed against the barriers, craning their necks to get a better view of the commotion. Some recorded videos on their phones, while others whispered excitedly about witnessing history in the making. Did Chuck Norris really punch that guy? One woman asked her friend, her eyes wide with disbelief. Chuck stood quietly to the side, his hand still raised in a gesture of cooperation. Despite the chaos swirling around him, he remained calm and composed. He knew this wasn't how his visit to London was supposed to go, but he also understood why the authorities needed to step in. When one of the officers approached him again, Chuck reiterated his explanation patiently. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "That man was disrespecting the guard, and I thought someone needed to step in before things got worse." The officer nodded but didn't seem entirely convinced. "We'll need you to come with us to answer some questions," he said firmly, gesturing toward a waiting police car. Chuck complied without argument, knowing it was part of the process. As he walked past the crowd, murmurs erupted. Some people clapped or cheered, clearly siding with him, while others shook their heads disapprovingly. The divide in opinions was palpable, and Chuck couldn't help but feel conflicted. On one hand, he believed he'd done the right thing by standing up for respect and discipline. On the other, he recognized that his actions might have caused more problems than they solved. At the police station, the questioning began almost immediately. Officers grilled Chuck about the altercation, asking for every detail, from why he felt the need to intervene to whether he regretted throwing the punch. Chuck answered honestly, explaining that he hadn't intended to hurt anyone but simply wanted to stop the harassment. "I'd spent my life teaching self-defense and promoting peace," he told them. "But sometimes, when words aren't enough, you have to act." Meanwhile, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with posts and memes about the event. Headlines like "Chuck Norris versus Royal Guardsman," "What Really Happened," dominated websites, and late-night talk show hosts eagerly added the story to their monologues. People debated endlessly. Was Chuck a hero for defending the guard, or had he overstepped by using force? Back in the U.S., fans rallied behind him, praising his courage and sense of justice. In Britain, however, opinions were more divided. Many admired his willingness to stand up for what he believed in, but others argued that even legends should follow the rules. As hours passed, authorities weighed their options carefully. Deporting Chuck Norris, a global icon known for his humility and good deeds, would undoubtedly draw criticism. Yet allowing such behavior to go unchecked risked setting a dangerous precedent. After much deliberation, a decision was reached. Chuck would be deported from the country within the hour, with a formal apology issued to the British government and the royal family. When the news was delivered to Chuck, he listened quietly, nodding in understanding. "I respect your decision," he said to the officer, his tone respectful but tinged with disappointment. He had hoped to leave London on a positive note, not as someone being escorted out under less than ideal circumstances. Still, he accepted responsibility for his actions, knowing that accountability was part of leadership. Before leaving the station, Chuck took a moment to reflect. He gazed out the window at the bustling city beyond, its streets filled with people going about their lives. For all its beauty and history, London had proven to be unpredictable, and perhaps that was part of its charm. Chuck smiled faintly, reminding himself that even legends weren't immune to making mistakes. As he prepared to board the plane back home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would stay with him forever, not because of the headlines or the controversy, but because of the lessons learned along the way. The decision to deport Chuck Norris sent ripples through diplomatic circles, adding a layer of complexity to an already unusual situation. At Scotland Yard, officials huddled in a conference room, discussing the potential fallout from their choice. Deporting a global celebrity like Chuck wasn't just a local matter, it had international implications. Representatives from Buckingham Palace weighed in, expressing concern over how this incident might reflect on the royal family and British traditions. While no one doubted Chuck's intentions, the optics of allowing a foreigner to physically intervene near royal grounds were problematic. British diplomats contacted their counterparts in the United States, explaining the reasoning behind the deportation order while emphasizing that it wasn't personal. They framed it as a necessary step to uphold the dignity of the monarchy and maintain public order. On the American side, officials expressed understanding but also urged caution. Chuck Norris wasn't just any citizen. He was a beloved figure whose actions often inspired admiration. Handling the situation poorly could strain relations between the two nations, or at least create awkward headlines. Back at the police station, Chuck was informed of the deportation order. The officer delivering the news did so with visible discomfort, clearly aware of how surreal the situation was. "Mr. Norris, we've decided that it would be best if you return to the United States as soon as possible," he said, avoiding eye contact. "You'll be escorted to the airport and put on the next available flight." Chuck listened intently, his expression unreadable. When the officer finished speaking, Chuck nodded slowly. "I understand," he replied, his voice calm but tinged with regret. "I never meant to cause trouble for anyone, not for the guards, not for your country, and certainly not for the royal family. If my actions cause harm, I'm truly sorry." His sincerity seemed genuine, and even the hardened officers found themselves softening slightly toward him. As preparations were made for his departure, Chuck took a moment to write a brief statement. He wanted to address the public directly, ensuring that his side of the story was heard without coming across as defensive or dismissive. In clear, heartfelt language, he apologized for any disruption caused by his involvement. "I came to London to spread goodwill and enjoy its rich history," he wrote. "What happened today was never part of the plan, and I deeply regret if my actions overshadowed the respect I have for this incredible city and its people." By the time Chuck stepped outside the police station, a crowd had gathered once again. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and spectators jockeyed for position to catch a glimpse of the man at the center of the storm. Chuck paused briefly, raising a hand to quiet the noise. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying authority despite the chaos. "I want to say that I stand by my belief in standing up for what's right. But I also recognize that there are rules and boundaries, especially when you're a guest in someone else's home. Today, I crossed a line, and for that, I am truly sorry." His words struck a chord with many. Some in the crowd applauded, moved by his humility, while others remained skeptical. Regardless of where they stood, everyone agreed that Chuck handled the situation with grace under pressure. As he climbed into the waiting car, bound for Heathrow Airport, a few bystanders waved goodbye, holding signs that read, "Come back soon, Chuck." At the airport, security personnel ensured a smooth departure, keeping curious onlookers at bay. Chuck boarded the plane quietly, tipping his cowboy hat to the flight attendants as he settled into his seat. Looking out the window, He watched as London faded into the distance below. Despite the whirlwind of events, he felt a strange sense of peace. Mistakes had been made, lessons had been learned, and though he wouldn't soon forget this trip, he knew life and his legacy would move forward. For Britain, the incident sparked debates about cultural differences, personal responsibility, and the delicate balance between tradition and modernity. For Chuck Norris, it served as a reminder that even legends aren't above accountability. And sometimes, doing the right thing comes with unexpected consequences. As the plane soared above the clouds, carrying Chuck Norris back to the United States, news of his deportation spread like wildfire across the globe. Within hours, the story dominated headlines in every corner of the world. From morning talk shows to late-night comedy sketches, everyone had something to say about the man who had punched a troublemaker near Buckingham Palace and been escorted out of the country shortly after. The incident became a cultural phenomenon, sparking debates, jokes, and even admiration for Chuck's unshakable sense of justice. Back home, Americans rallied behind their hero. Fans took to social media, flooding platforms with memes and hashtags like #ChuckStandsForRespect and #RoundhouseDiplomacy. Some joked that Chuck had punched his way into history, while others praised him for standing up against disrespect, even if it meant facing consequences. Late-night hosts couldn't resist poking fun at the situation, with one quipping, "Only Chuck Norris could get deported for doing exactly what we'd expect him to do." Despite the humor, many people understood the deeper message behind the story. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't always easy or consequence-free. In London, reactions were more mixed. While some residents admired Chuck's boldness, others felt that his actions undermined British decorum and tradition. Letters to local newspapers poured in, debating whether the Royal Guardsman deserved protection from harassment and whether Chuck's intervention had been justified. A few commentators argued that the real issue lay with the unruly tourists who had provoked the situation in the first place. If those troublemakers hadn't disrespected the guard, one columnist wrote, none of this would have happened. Despite the divided opinions, one thing was clear. No one could ignore the impact of Chuck's actions. Even Buckingham Palace released a brief statement acknowledging the incident, emphasizing the importance of respecting national symbols and traditions. Though diplomatic tensions remained minimal, officials made it clear that such behavior, no matter who was involved, would not be tolerated again. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris returned to his quiet life in Texas, where he tried to put the whirlwind trip behind him. But escaping the spotlight proved impossible. Journalists camped outside his ranch, eager for an exclusive interview. Neighbors stopped by to share their thoughts, some offering support and others simply curious about how he felt. When asked during a rare public appearance, Chuck addressed the incident with characteristic humility. "I don't regret standing up for respect," he said, leaning casually against a podium. "But I do regret any trouble my actions caused. Sometimes, even legends make mistakes." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with audiences worldwide. People admired Chuck not just for his strength or fame, but for his willingness to own up to his missteps. In a world often filled with arrogance and defensiveness, his honesty stood out as refreshingly human. It reminded everyone that even someone as larger-than-life as Chuck Norris wasn't immune to imperfection, and that owning your actions was a sign of true strength. Over time, the initial shock of the incident gave way to reflection. Teachers used the story in classrooms to discuss topics like cultural sensitivity, personal responsibility, and the balance between standing up for what's right and respecting boundaries. Comedians continued to mine the event for material, turning phrases like, "Don't mess with Chuck," or "the Queen," into punchlines. And yet, beneath all the jokes and discussions, there lingered a universal appreciation for the values Chuck represented: courage, integrity, and a steadfast commitment to doing what you believe is right. By the time weeks turned into months, the uproar began to fade, but the legacy of the incident endured. For tourists visiting Buckingham Palace, tour guides couldn't resist recounting the tale of the day Chuck Norris stepped in to defend a royal guardsman. Children giggled at the image of the legendary martial artist squaring off against a troublemaker, while adults nodded knowingly, recognizing the complexities of the moment. Whether seen as a cautionary tale or a modern legend, the story became part of London's rich tapestry, a reminder that history isn't just shaped by kings and queens, but also by the unexpected actions of ordinary and extraordinary people alike. The legacy of Chuck Norris's unexpected adventure in London continued to grow long after the initial buzz had faded. What started as a simple trip to promote goodwill turned into one of the most talked about incidents of his life, and perhaps one of the most memorable moments in modern British history. Decades later, tourists visiting Buckingham Palace still whispered about the day Chuck Norris met the royal guardsman. It became a quirky piece of folklore, blending humor, respect, and a touch of disbelief. For Chuck himself, the incident served as both a lesson and a reminder. He often reflected on it during interviews or casual conversations with friends. "That trip taught me something important," he'd say with a wry smile. "Even when you think you're doing the right thing, there are always consequences. You can't control how people react, but you can control how you handle yourself afterward." His words carried weight because they came from experience, not just the kind seen in movies, but the real-life challenges of living up to your own principles. Over time, the story took on a life of its own. Writers included it in books about unusual historical events. Filmmakers pitched lighthearted comedies based on the incident, and even schools used it as a case study for discussions about ethics and cultural differences. Teachers loved asking students, "Was Chuck right to step in? Could he have handled things differently?" The answers varied, but everyone agreed that the story sparked meaningful conversations about respect, authority, and personal responsibility. In Britain, the tale became part of the country's shared memory. Tour guides near Buckingham Palace made sure to mention it, often adding playful commentary. "And over here," they'd say, gesturing dramatically toward the palace gates, "is where Chuck Norris showed us all that even legends aren't immune to making headlines." Visitors would laugh, snapping photos of the spot where the infamous punch occurred. Some even joked about leaving flowers for the royal guardsmen involved, though no one could recall which guard it was. After all, they were trained to remain anonymous. Back in the United States, Chuck's fans embraced the story with pride. It reinforced their image of him as not just a martial arts icon, but also a man who stood firmly for what he believed in. At charity events and public appearances, people frequently brought it up, half-jokingly asking if he planned to return to London anytime soon. Chuck always responded with good humor, saying, "If they'll let me back in, I'd love to go. But next time, I promise to leave my fists at home." Despite the temporary ban, relations between Chuck and the UK eventually warmed. Years later, he received an invitation to visit again, this time as a guest of honor at a special event celebrating cross-cultural friendships. When he stepped off the plane, the same reporters who had covered his deportation greeted him with smiles and applause. "Welcome back, Mr. Norris," one journalist said warmly. "We missed you." Chuck chuckled, tipping his cowboy hat. "Good to be back," he replied. "And don't worry, I've learned my lesson. No more punching while I'm here." Of course, the story didn't end without its share of jokes and tall tales. Urban legends sprang up, claiming everything from Chuck teaching the guards secret self-defense moves to him bench-pressing Big Ben during his stay. While none of these stories were true, they added to the charm of the original incident, turning it into a myth-like narrative that blended fact and fiction. Ultimately, the legacy of Chuck Norris's London escapade wasn't about the punch itself. It was about the values it represented: respect, accountability, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. These themes resonated deeply with people around the world, ensuring that the story would never truly fade away. As Chuck himself once quipped during an interview, "I may not have thrown that hard, but apparently, I threw enough to make history." With a wink and a nod, He reminded everyone that sometimes the best stories are the ones we least expect. And in Chuck Norris's case, those stories often come with a roundhouse kick, or at least a punch heard round the world.